Logging is essential for building dependable and maintainable software applications. With a proper logging setup, you can record events and diagnose issues that occur in your applications and build an audit trail for your software. And by building this trail, you can help diagnose issues and you can understand the runtime behavior of your application. And a good logging system will allow you to solve critical problems very quickly in your application. For example, you might email administrative users when a problem occurs, and that problem can then be fixed very quickly. And logs can also be analyzed and charted to get further insights into your software using log aggregation systems. We're going to see that later in this video. So this video is going to be a deep dive into how to do logging with Django web framework applications. We're going to start with a brief overview of logging in Python, and then we'll see how to build out the logging functionality in Django using one of the settings that the framework provides. And we're going to see also how to integrate that with an external log provider later in the video. So let's get started, and we're going to start by looking at the logging module that's built into the Python standard library. This is a module that defines functions and classes that implement a flexible event logging system for applications and libraries. So this package standardizes logging in Python, and it provides you a lot of utilities that you can use, and it can be imported, as it says here, from the standard library. We're going to start in this video by looking at a sample application, just a script in Python. So I'm going to open VS Code and I'm going to walk through the code that we have here, and we're going to understand what comprises the logging module in Python. So we're importing the logging module and also the sys module from Python. And then what we're doing is we're creating a logger object. We're using the logging module's getLogger function, and we can pass any name we want for our logger. I'm just calling it myLogger here. Now the loggers are one of the key objects that are provided by the logging module. And what I'm going to do is go back to the documentation, this time for Django, and there will be links to these documentation pages below the video. What we're going to do is look at what Django calls the cast of players in the logging configuration for the web framework. Now Django extends the Python logging module, that's the one that we just looked at here, and it provides its own way to configure the logging module that we're going to look at later in the video. But the cast of players is what we're going to focus on now, and we have four main objects that are involved in the Python logging module. We have a logger object, and that's what we just saw here. This is kind of like the root object in the logging system. We define a logger and we give it a name, and what we also have is handlers, filters and formatters. So let's quickly describe each of these objects. The loggers, they are the entry point into the logging system, and each logger is a named bucket to which messages can be written for processing. And loggers have this important concept of a log level. The log level describes the severity of the messages that the logger will handle, and by default Python has 5 log levels. We have debug, which is the lowest level. Then we have info for general system information. We also have the warning log level, which describes a minor problem. So you might want to log those out and analyze what those minor problems are. But we have some more serious log levels as well. We have error, and that's a major problem that has occurred in your system. And we also have critical for describing a critical problem. So each log that you write to the output will have one of those levels, and if you need to, you can also extend these in Python and add your own log levels as well. So the logger is the entry point into the logging system. If we scroll down, we come to the handlers section. The handler is the engine that determines what happens to each message in a logger. So it's going to describe the logging behavior. For example, writing a message to the screen or to the console, or writing it to a file, or sending it to an HTTP endpoint to an external service. You can do all of that with Python, and the handler is basically going to describe where you're going to send your log messages to. As well as handlers, we have filters. These can provide control over which log records are passed from the logger to the handler. We're not going to cover filters in this video. If you're interested in that, we can do a follow-up on that topic. We also have formatters, which are quite simple. These simply describe how the log record needs to be rendered as text. And a formatter consists of a string containing log record attributes. If we follow through to the link here, we are taken to another page in Python's logging module, and there are attributes for things such as the time at which the log has occurred, and we also have things such as the level number, the message that's actually being logged to the system, and many more variables or attributes that we can attach to our messages. So what we're going to do is we're going to now look at that Python application that we we saw in Visual Studio Code. We've already defined the logger object. What we're doing in this application is we're also defining two handlers here. We're defining a stream handler that's going to write to standard out. And that's why we're importing the sys module at the top, so we can specify the stream that we're writing to here. That is the standard output stream on the system. And below that we have a second handler. This is a file handler, and it's going to write to the file that we provide here as an argument. In our case, it's going to be logs.txt. And what we do is we take the logger object that we created, and we're going to add each of those handlers to that logger. So we're adding the console handler on the first line here, and then we add the file handler. So the important takeaway there is that a logger can actually have multiple handlers, and it's going to send the log output to all of the handlers that are added to that logger. And above this we also have a formatter, which is currently commented out. We'll bring that in a second. What we've got at the bottom of this file is a function called division that's going to try and divide the first argument by the second argument, and you can see that operation here within a try except statement. Of course, the potential problem there is that we might try and divide by 0, in which case we're going to send a logger.error message out to our handlers. And what we're going to do in this block at the bottom here, when the Python script is called, we're going to call the division function and pass in as the denominator 0, so that we're going to see what the logging.error message is going to output here. So let's bring up a terminal here, and what I'm going to do is run this program. So we're going to say python logs.py, and you can see we get this basic output message here, division by 0 error with parameters 4 and 0. Now if we want to customize the message that we're getting output by the logger, what we can do is we can go up to this section that we've commented out here, and that's where we define a logging.formatter object, and we're passing a particular format string to the formatter, and we're referencing some of those log record attributes: the name, the current time when the log is generated, the level name, and also the message. So let's try and re-execute this, but first of all we need to actually add the formatter to our handlers. So we're going to add it to the file handler and also the console handler here, and we do that by calling the handler's setFormatter function and passing that in as an argument. Let's re-execute this script at the bottom, and then we can see we get the formatted log message. It contains the name of the logger, and that name is on the left hand side here. Then we get the time when the log was generated. We're getting the level, which is an error message, and that's because we are calling logger.error within this function here. And finally we're getting the message at the bottom here that was output to the log file. Now you'll notice that this is on the console here, but we also have a file on the left hand side called logs.txt, and if we open that we're going to see the same output in this file as we saw on the console. And the reason for that is because if we go back to the program and we scroll up here, we're creating two handler objects here and adding both to the logger object. So we're going to send the log output to both of those handlers, so both the console and the file. Now before we go on, it's worth noting about some security implications here. You don't want to be outputting logs containing things like email addresses and passwords or credit card information or anything like that, so you need to be careful what you're putting in your logs when you're outputting these messages. Be careful not to include any sensitive information in log files, and always assume that the log files can be read by anyone. So that's a very quick overview of Python's logging module. We've seen the logger object, we've seen the formatter object that allows us to determine the format of the output, and we've seen the handler objects that we've got here, and these allow us to send the output to a particular location. What we're going to do now is move on and see how to use logging in a Django application. So I've just added a Django project here, and this has some very simple configuration. And what we're going to do is we're going to see how to use this settings.py file in order to set up logging in a Django application. And we're going to see the different settings that we can use, and later on how to integrate it with a log aggregation service. Let's start by going to Django's documentation on logging again. We saw the cast of players earlier in this video. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at how to configure logging in Django. Now by default, Django uses what's called the dict_config format. So in order to configure logging, you define a setting called logging, and those settings are going to describe the loggers, the handlers, the filters, and the formatters that you want in your Django logging setup, as well as things like the log levels and any other properties. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add that setting of logging. So let's scroll down a little here. I'm going to copy a couple of the statements here, I'm just going to copy the top of this dictionary and we're going to go to settings.py and let's scroll right to the bottom of this file and we'll paste those in there and we'll close off that dictionary. So because we're using this dict logging format, that has a version which is just 1 by default, and that's the only version that exists at the moment. We have a variable here called disable existing loggers, which we're setting to false, and normally you would want to keep that as false in a Django application. We're now going to start defining the actual logger objects and handlers within this dictionary. If we go back to the documentation, we can see how to do that. We have a key within this logging dictionary for our handlers, and you can see we have another key here called root as well. So we can define any handlers within the handlers block, and we can also define loggers in this block here. And this setup is going to configure the root logger to send messages with a warning level and higher to the console. So why is that happening in this setup? We have the root logger here and we're adding the handlers to that within that block, and we're setting it to the console handler, which refers to this handler that we define in the handlers section above, and that is going to be a logging.stream handler, and that's something we saw earlier in the script. That logs the output to whatever location you provide as the stream to that class. And the logger object also has the level set here to warning. What that means is that only messages with a level of warning or above are going to be output to the handlers. So we will see warning messages in the log, and we're also going to see the error messages and the critical messages because those log levels are higher than the warning log level. So let's go back to Django and we're going to define a block for our handlers now. And I'm going to scroll down a bit to give us some more space here. So that's going to be another dictionary. This is a nested dictionary, and we can name our handlers here. I'm just going to call this one file, and that's going to output to a file handler. So what we do within the file block is we define the class of the particular handler that we want to use. What we're going to use is the logging.fileHandler class, and then we can set a file name, of course. If we're logging to a file, we need to tell Django, or rather we need to tell the file handler, where do we want to actually send those logs. I'm just going to create a log called general.log, and we can set a level here as well, which I'm going to set to, let's say, debug, so that we see basically every message that's being logged. So just to recap, we're setting up a file handler here, and that's an instance of logging.filehandler, and it's going to output those logs to the general.log file. Now after the handlers, let's define another key within this logging dictionary. This one's going to be called loggers, and that's going to define any logging objects that we want to use within this Django application. Now you can provide a catch-all by providing an empty string rather than creating a named logger. We just create an empty string that maps to a dictionary here, and then we can provide again the level for the messages or the logs that we want to output. Again, we'll set that to debug, but a logger needs to have a handler attached so that it knows where to send those messages. So we're going to set a handlers dictionary here, and actually that won't be a dictionary, that will be a Python list, and we're going to set it to the file handler that we created above within the handlers section. Now I'm going to reference another page of Django's documentation just to explain this catch-all empty string that we're defining here within the loggers dictionary. Let's go back to a page here that I'll link below the video, and this is about how to configure those logger mappings. Now you can see in this documentation that they're using that empty string here, and if we look at the paragraph below here, you can see that the mapping name determines which log records it will process, but the configuration with the empty string is unnamed. And that means that it's going to process records from all loggers. So what we're doing here in this setting by defining an empty string is we're telling Django that we want all of the log outputs to be sent to this particular logger configuration that we have here. You can get more granular than this, and we're going to see examples of that later on. Now what we're going to do is save the settings.py file. We have, just to recap, added a logging dictionary that's going to tell Django how we want to configure and define the logging in this application. What I'm going to do in this Django project is go to the views.py file, and we're going to go to the top here, and I'm going to import the logging library from Python. And once we've imported the logging module, I'm going to create a logger here. We can do that by calling the module's getLogger function, and again we pass a name in there for the logger. As you can see in VS Code, when you call this function, it's going to return a logger with the specified name, and it will create that if necessary. And in order to give the logger the same name as this module, we can use this statement here. This is _name__, and that is a Python variable that evaluates to the name of the current module. So that's going to evaluate to core.views within this Django application. Core comes from the name of the app in Django. You can see that on the left hand side here. We have an app called core, and the file that we're in is the views.py file. So we're giving the logger a name that is relative to the file in which it's being used, and you can do this throughout all of the files in a Python application, and then you'll get a logger that's kind of specific to each module. And that can help with organizing the logs that you've got when you come to analyze them later on. So that's us created a logger object here. We're going to use that object here within the index view that came with this starter code. So what I'm going to do at the top of that view is just log out a dummy message. We're going to use the logger, and let's just use the .info method here, and we can pass a message into that method. So I'm going to pass just a basic message here that we're testing the logger. And what we're also going to do is import from Django its user model, and we're going to try a lookup here that we know is not going to return an object because that user does not exist in the database. So we're going to define a try except block, and I'm going to try and look up the user by an ID, so user.objects.get, and let's pass a primary key of 1 in here. Now we don't have any users in this dummy application, so we're not going to get a result here. So this exception is going to be called, or rather the exception block is going to be executed here, and what we can do within that block is called the logger.error function, and we can pass a message into that function. So I'm going to say user with ID and then reference the ID that was passed in does not exist, and we can pass a second argument to logger.error, and in fact it can take as many arguments as we provide as placeholders in this string. So we're passing the primary key of 1, that user does not exist, and that's going to be defined as an error log. So we have two logging messages here, a logger.info call and also a logger.error call if this lookup to a user does not exist. So let's test this out and save the views.py file, and we're going to first of all run the python manage.py migrate function, and that's going to generate the database that we're going to use. And that's just a local SQLite database. Once we've done that, what we can do is run the Django server, and we're going to visit this index URL here. So the URL is just the root path in this application. So what I'm going to do is go to localhost 8000 here, and when we go to that in the browser, you can see a message of hello here. What we're going to do is see if our handler and our logger are working by going back to VS Code, and we should see a log file that's been generated within the core application, or within the project, sorry. And you can see we have a file here called general.log. And if we load that file, you can see we're getting all of the log output because we used that catch-all empty string logger here. We're getting the Django logs, for example this one from the stat reloader, but we do get our message here where we test that logger out, and we also get the logging.error message where the user with ID 1 does not exist. Now these are pretty bare bones messages at the moment. When you include logging, you really need to include as much useful information as possible to help you diagnose where and when that problem has occurred. So what we're going to do is go back to settings.py, and we're going to create better log messages by defining a formatters block. So this logging configuration in Django, as well as the handlers and the loggers, we also can define formatters that we can then add to our handlers. So let's define a formatter here. We'll call it a simple formatter, and we can define the configuration for that formatter in here. What we need to give that is a format, and I'm going to reference some of those log record variables that we're going to look at in a second. So the level name, which is going to be info or error or so on, will output that level name, and we also want to output the log message itself. And what we also can do is define the style of the output here with a key called style, and we can just pass a single curly brace as the value for that output. And to see why, I'm going to go back to Django's documentation. And there's a section on the logging how-to on configuring a formatter. And you can see we use those log record attributes such as name and level name, and also the time of the actual log output. But if we go down here, we can also see the style keyword, and this curly brace means that it's going to use the string.format style in Python, whereas a $sign there will use the string.template formatting. So if you want to refer to these log record variables just using the curly braces and then the name of the variable, you can set the style to that curly brace. Now once we've created the formatter, which we've given a name of simple, what we're going to do is go up to our handler here, and this is the file handler, and we can add a formatter to the handler here. So I'm going to add a key of formatter, and we can paste the name of that formatter, which is just simple, and then we can save this, and we're going to test out this application again by going back to this page. And if we refresh the page and go back to the general.log file, you can see we're getting a slightly more informative set of messages now. We have the log level as well as the message. Now we might also want to know the time when these logs occurred, so what we can do is go back to the formatter, and I'm going to add another one of these log record variables here, and it's going to be ASC time, basically the current time at which this log was generated. If we save that, go back and refresh the page, when we go to general.log, you can see at the bottom we're now getting the timestamp when these logs were generated, both the info and the error log. And we can define as many formatters as we want here. So as well as the simple formatter, I'm going to paste another one in here, and let me tab that over so that it looks better. We have one here called verbose, where we have many more variables in the format of this particular formatter. So as well as the time and the level name, we also have the name of the formatter and the module that was generating that log message. And then we also have the line number as well here, using the line number variable, and finally the message is output as well. So we've called this one verbose. What we can do is scroll up to the file handler, and we're going to change the formatter that's being used to verbose here, and we can go back to general.log, and what I'm going to do is go back to the page, refresh the page, and now we can see we're getting a more verbose message here. Beforehand we just had the time, the log level and the message. What we've got now, as you can see at the bottom, is we also have the module and the name of the logger that's being used here. So this is the name of the logger, core.views, we have the module and also the line number as well. So this is a more verbose logger that allows us to get more information from our log files. So if there was ever a problem in our application, a log like this one is going to tell us a lot more information than some of the logs that we set up at the beginning here. So let's scroll to the bottom here, and in fact for now I'm going to clear out this log file and save it. What I'm going to do is go back to settings.py, and as well as the file handler, we can also add other handlers to this application. So I'm going to add another one here, which we're going to call the console handler, and that's going to be another dictionary here, and I'm just going to copy some settings in. So for the console handler, we're using the stream handler class instead of the file handler, and that's going to output these logs to the terminal basically. We're setting the level of those messages to debug, and we're also setting the formatter to the simple formatter that we defined here. So not the verbose one like the file is using, we're now using a different formatter for our new console handler. Now in order to use that, we need to go to the loggers section and actually reference that handler within here. So we're going to copy the name console, and within this list of handlers we can paste that in, and that's then going to send the logs to all of the handlers that are defined within this list. So let's see if we get some messages on the terminal now when we go back to our page and refresh the page. If we go to the terminal, you can see we are now getting some messages, and this is using the simple formatter, so we're only getting the time, the log level and also the message. So we're learning a bit here about how to use Django's logging setting here, which is using the dictionary to define how we want our handlers, our loggers and our formatters to handle our log outputs. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at configuring log levels dynamically using environment variables. So what I'm going to do is stop the Django server, and we're going to install a library just now that's going to allow us to read in settings from an environment file. Now actually, let's have a look at why we might want to do this. We have here a file handler, and we've hard-coded the name of the file that we want to log this output to. And that might not be what you want to do. You might want to have this determined by an environment file, and you can set that up per server and define the name and location of the files that you want to log your output to. Any kind of hard coding of strings like this is generally not the best practice when it comes to these settings. And another thing we can do is move the level of the logging out to an environment file as well. And that means that we can maybe specify a level of debug or info on development, but for production you might want to only look at warnings and above, or vice versa. The point is that we want these settings here to be configurable from an environment variable file. So what we're going to do is move these hard-coded settings out of settings.py, and within this application I'm going to create an environment file, a .env file. And I'm going to paste in two settings that we want to use here, a Django log level, which we're going to set to debug, and also a Django log file. Let's specify a new file here called django-logs.txt. Now in order to actually reference these values in our Django settings.py file, what I'm going to do is scroll to the top, and we're going to need to import a module here, or rather install a new module, I'm going to go to the documentation for this module. It's called Django-environ. And this package allows you to use the 12-factor methodology, where you can configure your application using environment variables that can be changed very easily for development versus production versus testing and so on. So what we're going to do is scroll down and we're going to go to the installation section, and I'll leave a link to this below the video. We're going to copy the pip install command and we're going to go back to VS Code and install that into our virtual environment. Once that's installed, we can then use the library. So let's go back to the documentation, and the quick start is going to help us out here. We import an environ object, so let's copy that into the top here, just underneath the pathlib import. And then once we've imported that, what we're going to do is set up an env object here. So let's copy this again, and we're going to paste that in at the top here. We're setting up the env object that's going to allow us to then read the values from this .env file. And in order to read those values, we are going to copy one final statement. It's this one here, and I'll copy the comment as well actually, and we can paste that into the file. We need to do this below the base directory, and that's because we're referencing that base directory here. And we're using pathlib. The base directory is an instance of a pathlib.path object. So we're going to use the pathlib syntax here to reference that .env file that exists in the base directory. So what this is doing, as it says in the comment, it's going to take the environment variables from the .env file and it's going to load them into our env object that we've defined here. And we can then reference these values by the key name, for example, Django log level. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to settings and we're going to do that down at the bottom where we're defining these logging settings. So the file name here, we want to get rid of the hard-coded reference to that, and we're going to use the env object and reference the value that's coming from our environment file. That's the Django log file setting. So let's paste that in there. And we also want to remove the hard-coded level here. We're going to change that and reference again the name of the variable in the .env file. So let's paste that in there. That's the Django log level. And we're going to use that in multiple places throughout this configuration. So let's copy that. And for the console handler, we're going to use that there as well. And also within our loggers setting, we're going to paste that in there too. What I'm going to do now is just test that this is working. So let's start up Django's development server here, and then we're going to go back to this page and refresh the page. If we go back to VS Code, you now see that we have a new file here called Django logs.txt, and that is the file that is being referenced in the .env file here, and we're reading that in the settings, and we're applying that file to our file handler here. So this is working, the setup is working, and we're getting our logs now in this file. What we're going to do now is look at a new concept, and that's logger namespacing. So far we've been using an unnamed logging configuration just with an empty string. When you use a named logging configuration, that will capture the logs only from the loggers that have a matching name. Now what we've done before in the views.py file, if we open that now, we have defined a logger here, and we're giving it a name of core.views, basically calling it the name of the module. So if we only want to capture the logs from that particular logger, what we can do is go back to settings.py, and in the loggers setting, instead of using an empty string, we can use the name of the logger that we want to target here with these settings. So we're going to say core.views is the name of that logger, and that allows us to target only the logs from the views.py file. So if we go back to our application and refresh this, we are still going to see the same result here. If we go to the Django logs, we're still getting this output. But if we were to add logging in one of the other modules here and try and log that out, that would not be sent to this particular setting here, because this is only going to capture the logs from the core.views logger. Now we're going to demonstrate something new here. That's logging hierarchy. I'm going to copy these settings and I'm going to paste them in here, and I'm going to remove the .views part of this logger here. We're going to just call that one core, and the second one is called core.views. So we now have two separate loggers defined in this settings.py file. Now as we said, the core.views logger is only going to capture logs from the views.py file because we've given the logger in that file that particular name. But the core logger, on the other hand, is going to capture all of the logs from the core application, including logs from the views.py file. If we go back to the documentation on this, we have a section here on logger hierarchies and propagation. And as it says, logger naming is hierarchical. A logger called myapp would be the parent of myapp.views, and unless specified otherwise, logger mappings will propagate the records that they process to the parent loggers. So a record from a logger called myapp.views.private, that will be handled by both the myapp and also the myapp.views loggers because of that hierarchical relationship. So what we're going to do is see that in action now. We have created these two loggers, and the core logger can be thought of as a parent to the core.views logger, which means that any logs generated by core.views are also going to be sent to the core logger. Let's see a demo of that now. What I'm going to do is go up to our handlers here, and I'm going to define a new handler just for demonstration purposes here. And again, I'll need to tab that over. We have the handler called file views, and that's an instance of a file handler, and we've changed the file name where this handler is going to output its logs to. And for the level, I need to reference the value in the environment here. So this is our new handler, it's called file views. We're going to use that handler here within the core.views logger. So let's paste that in there, and this time the core.views logger is only going to use the file views handler. So let's run the server again, and we're going to test out what is going to happen here. If we go back to our page and refresh the page, we can go back to our Django application, and we're going to go to that particular views file handler. If we click this file, this is the file where our new file handler is going to send its logs to, and this is just the one that was defined here in the core.views logger. So that core.views logger is sending its output to this handler called file views. But remember this relationship, this hierarchy. The core logger is a parent of core.views. So what's going to happen is if we look at the Django logs.views.txt, we get these messages here, but these messages are also going to be in the Django logs here. And just to make this a bit clearer, I'm going to remove all of the logs from both of these files. And if we go back and refresh this page and go back to these log files, you can see the views logger has both of the lines, but this one also has the lines, and that's because the logs that are generated for this particular logger are also being sent to the handlers defined for the parent. So you end up with the output from this particular logger also being sent to the parent, where it's also sent to that parent's handlers. Now you can disable this behavior by adding a key called propagate and setting that to false in the child handler. So this time if we save settings.py, go back to our page and refresh the page, if we go back to the views logger here, we can see we get the two new messages, but now if we go back to the Django logs.txt, and this is the one that's attached to the parent's file handler, we no longer get those messages because we have set propagate to false in the child logger. So there is a hierarchical relationship between loggers based on the name of that logger, and you can use the propagate key here in order to control whether or not you want those logs to propagate to the parents or not. Now we've covered a lot of ground here and how to use logging in Django and Python in general. What we're going to do now is bring in a log aggregation service, and that's going to allow us to send these logs to an external location where we can use a service that's specialized for dealing with these logs and analyzing them, searching for particular items in the logs, and also creating dashboards and charts. And the service that we're going to use is this one here. It's called BetterStack, which has a logging platform for log management. And this platform is going to allow you to rapidly search through the logs that are being generated in your application. If we scroll down, we can get some more information here. For example, here you can see that BetterStack is going to aggregate all of your logs into structured data that you can then query with SQL. So you can send logs from all of your servers, your apps, your Docker containers, your Kubernetes clusters, and so on. Send them all into one place using this service, and then you can search and create dashboards based on these logs and the data that's in them. Now what I'm going to do is go back to the top here, and I'm going to sign in at the top. Let me try and make this a bit bigger so we can see that. I'm going to click sign in, and I'm going to sign up now with my email address. Now once you've logged in, you'll be taken to a page like this after filling in some basic details. We have a page here on sources, and as the info message says here, sources represent services that you want to collect logs from, and you can integrate your existing stack by adding a new source. So let's start by doing that just now. We're going to click the connect source button, and we're taken to this form here. We can give the source a name. I'm just going to call this Django test, and then we're going to set the platform after that, and you can see there's many integrations here with things like Docker and Kubernetes, Nginx, and there's integrations with Vercel and other platforms. We're going to scroll down to Python here, and we're going to select Python and click create source. So we've created a source here, and it's got an ID which is called Django test. That comes from the name that we just set, and we also have a source token. We're going to copy that by clicking this here, and that's copied to the clipboard, and we're going to reference that now within our environment file. So let's reopen that .env file. And what I'm going to do here is paste in the value here, and we're creating a variable called BetterStack source token, and we're setting that equal to this value here, which is the token that we got when we created that source on BetterStack. And you can see some other information here. We have a data retention period of 30 days, and that means that the logs that are generated here are kept around for 30 days before they're deleted. And if you need greater retention, you can sign up for a plan that will include that. What we now want to do is go back to our Django application, and we want to reference this source token in the logging settings, and we're going to define a new handler here. Now, in order to do this, we need to install another package that comes from BetterStack. Let's go to some documentation here. This is a page on Python logging, and it contains some steps that we can use here. Now, there's a package called 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 So what I'm going to do is copy the name of that. We're going to go back to the terminal, and we're going to run pip install, and we're going to call it 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 here. That's the name of the package. Once that's installed, we're going to then use that in our application. So if you look at the setup here, what we're getting here is we're adding a handler that we're calling logtail. Let me make this bigger again here so we can see it. And that logtail handler is referencing this class called logtail handler. And we can see that we're inputting the source token here where we have a key of source token. So we're going to copy this new handler called logtail, and we're going to go back to VS Code. So let's open settings.py, and within the handlers block, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove this file views handler for now, and I'm going to paste in that logtail handler here. And we're using the class logtail handler. That will only be available after you run that pip install command. And what we also need to do is replace the source token here with the token that we have in our environment file. So let's reference this BetterStack source token, and we can paste that into the env function. And of course, the final thing that we need to do here is we need to add this new logtail handler to the loggers that we have here, or rather the handlers that are defined for those loggers. So I'm going to add it to both of them. Let's add logtail to the core handler, and also let's paste it in here and replace the file views handler. Let's now start Django's development server, and we're going to go back to our application now and refresh this page. And let's now go back to the BetterStack console here. And I'm going to go to the live tail, and we're going to see if we're getting these messages sent to this server. Now, you might need to wait a second, but you can see we're getting some output now. For example, the error logs where the user with ID 1 does not exist, and also this info log as well. And I'm going to make this bigger again so we can see exactly what's going on here. I'm going to click the info messages for this, and we're going to see that we can actually filter down the logs to just the info messages. So this is very useful, and you can see at the top that it's added a filter here where the log level is set to info, and of course we can change that. For example, if we wanted to look only at error messages, we could change that to error, and we get back this here where we only have the error logs in this case. And we can look not only at the level, we could look at something like the severity, which is an integer between 1 and 5 in the case of these Python logs. We could look for all logs that have a severity of greater than 2. And if we search for that, we get back again only the error logs. If we change that to 1, we're going to get back the info log as well, which has that severity level of 2. So we can do these operations here where we can do equality checks or greater than or less than checks, and filter down the logs very easily by using these checks. And you can see as well we have two sources. This one comes by default when you sign up for BetterStack. But we have the second one here called Django test, and you can imagine if you had a complex system with multiple services, you could have multiple sources, and you can also filter these down by the source. For example, if I click Django test here, it's only going to give us back the logs from that particular source. So as well as aggregating logs from multiple places, you can also of course just look at one particular source. And we can do things like string contains searches. If we click this bar at the top here, what I can type is the message, so we can actually search through the message that's being sent in the log. If I click that, we can define what kind of operation, for example contains or does not contain, and there are also equality operations at the bottom. I'm going to look for any message that contains user, and if I execute that by clicking this at the top, we only get back the logs now that contain that message where the user ID does not exist. So it's very easy to search through the logs using BetterStack. I want to very quickly show one final thing before we finish the video. I'm going to click the Dashboards tab at the left hand side, and we're going to create a new dashboard here, and by default we'll use a blank dashboard to start with. We can add that, and then we can start creating charts in a dashboard, and this can be used to aggregate the logs that you're getting from your different sources and create visualizations and charts that help you gain insights into the events and issues that might be happening in your system. So I'm going to click create chart here, and we are going to get back this here. We have an SQL expression, and we can select a chart type on the right hand side. Now I'm going to select a bar chart just for the demonstration here. And as well as that, I'm going to change the source here to the Django test source. That's the application that we have been working on in this video. Once we've done that, we can click run query at the bottom, and we're going to see a chart appearing here. And this chart is basically aggregating the number of logs that are coming back at each timestamp. So we can generate charts and save those charts to our dashboard. So if I click save chart here and we go back to the dashboard section, I've got a new dashboard here that I can click, and we see this chart, and this chart will update in real time and give us some idea about the number of logs that are coming into our system. So if I go back to our application and we refresh this, we can go back to the dashboard, and this is going to update after a short period of time, and it's going to show us that new log that is coming into the system. And you can see that here. I think that's just updated now. We have the new log that's been generated at the current time. And again, we can configure these charts and change them as we want. And we have multiple chart types here on the right hand side. So we can build complex dashboards, and we can have line charts, bar charts, pie charts, scatter plots, and heat maps, and so on. Let's show one last thing before we finish this video. We have this bar chart here that is aggregating the logs that are coming in. What we can also do is flip the SQL here and do some log filtering to customize the chart even further. Now if I only wanted to look at the events in the system where the level is equal to error, we can add that log filter and run the query again, and it's going to generate the charts, and you can see the value has went from 2 to 1. So before we were getting 2 logs at this timestamp. One was the error log, but the other one was the info log, and that info log is what you see in the views.py file here, where we write testing the logger out to the system. So every time we go to that page, we get an info message and also the error message because the user does not exist. If we go back to the BetterStack dashboard here, you can see that value is down from 2 to 1. And if I remove the filter here and rerun the query, you can see there's now 2 logs being generated when we remove that filter. So there's a lot you can do with these dashboards to build a picture of the events that are happening and being generated by your system. But that's all for this video. This has been a quick dive into logging in Django and in Python. We've demonstrated a number of concepts here, including the main objects in Python's logging module, and also how to configure the logging dictionary setup in a Django web application. We've also seen how to send our logs to the BetterStack log aggregation service, where we can then collect those logs and analyze and search through them in order to get better insights into what's going on and what might be going wrong in our systems. So thank you for watching.